Hi everyone. This is Radio Free Gastonia, the internet's #1 source for emergency historical content. I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking about American life in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The theme of our episode today is High Water Everywhere. So the title of this comes from a song by Bob Dylan. I'm sorry, I know we keep talking about him. Called High Water, and it came out on an album that was published on September 11th, 2001, which you might recall is a significant day. This song is about like people being inundated, people being helpless, people being like attacked by a disaster that they can't control. High water everywhere, the shacks are sliding down, folks lose their possessions, folks are leaving town. Now, this song was actually about the 1927 Louisiana flood, which I think is very interesting, considering where we're going with this. But this song came out on the same day that the United States was attacked in an unprecedented attack on September 11th, 2001, by terrorists who were Islamic extremists in New York and D.C., and also the Down Plain in Pennsylvania. Like this was like nothing we had experienced before. Pearl Harbor, sort of. I mean, it was bad for sure, but it was in a colony. Like it was attacking a military base. It's not exactly the same thing. This was a direct attack on American citizens, and we responded to it as an act of war. So we will get into that. However, at the same time, in 2001, this author, Barbara Ehrenreich, I've asked you to read part of her book, Nickel and Dime. She was a progressive author and activist who went undercover, sort of, as a low wage worker, as a waitress or a maid, to show, like, is it possible for someone to actually, like, make this wage and pay this rent? Like, in Orlando or wherever. Like, can anyone make this money and pay for their rent, their food, maybe healthcare, which they don't have? What Ehrenreich was showing is that that's extremely fucking hard, no matter where you are as a low wage employee at the time. So there's kind of like these two different ideas of like America. Like on one hand, the American idea is being attacked externally by Al Qaeda, by the terrorists that are really very aggressively challenging the idea of U.S. foreign policy and America's place in the world, America's culture. They do not like it. They are against it, clearly. On the other hand, you have an internal critique of like, well, what is actually going on in this country? Like, what's going on with our economy, our culture, where people are living on $5 an hour and can barely make the rent and survive. So I put these two things together not because they are equivalent, but because they are simultaneous. So anyway, um, our response to 9/11 is led by George W. Bush, who is the Republican president. He became president in 2000. I'm not going to go into all this. Basically, all I can say is that in 2000 it was a very close election, and George W. Bush became president because the Supreme Court called the election in his favor. Um, there were lots of votes to count, and it was like not clear who won, so the Supreme Court settled it. George W. was our president, and Bush responded to 9/11 by starting the global war on terror, the war on terror. Now, this is kind of like the Cold War, right? Like we were fighting against communism, now we're fighting against terror or Islamic extremism or whatever. But the difference is that, like, in the Cold War, we were at least fighting against the Soviet Union or Cuba or North Korea or something. Like, they're communists. We're fighting against an idea, but it's embodied by a state. In the case of the war on terror, we're fighting against just an idea, like terrorism or terror or Islamic extremism. And it's very hard to know how you win a war against an idea. So, in response to this, we invaded Afghanistan, which is where some of the terrorists were, or at least the Al Qaeda folks were, located. Um, but I remember, I'm not the smartest person in the world, believe it or not. I was a young, like, not very well informed person, but I do remember back in 2002 thinking, like, why are we talking about Iraq? Like, everything in the news, everything the White House is saying is about Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11, literally nothing. And all I could hear was like Iraq, 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 Iraq. And I was thinking, like, what's going on here? I mean, in some ways, you could definitely say that Afghanistan, like, we needed to be involved in that because that's where Osama bin Laden was. But with Iraq, it was just like, what are you guys talking about? But our leaders did lead us into this, saying, oh, they have weapons of mass destruction, they have nuclear weapons. Basically, the next attack on the United States is going, after 9/11, is going to be a nuke. It's going to be a Hiroshima. It's going to be something we did to another country, but, you know, footnote. So we went to Iraq based on this. You can do your own research, but I think it's like you can like investigate it. I think it's very clear that the weapons of mass destruction were not there. That this was all done on very flimsy premises is a generous way to say it. They were lies. We were A lot of Iraqi people died, and a lot of our own American service people died because of this dishonesty. I mean, that's just a fact. That's how I see it. You can look into it and see how you feel about it. So anyway, after Iraq, after Iraq, there was the 2004 election. Um, George W. Bush won this with a narrow but pretty convincing margin because um, there there was a strong spirit in the country that, like, we're going to support the commander in chief. We're in the middle of a war. We were just attacked like several years ago. Bush was offering a clear message, and the Democratic candidate John Kerry was offering a very muddled message of like, I'm going to like do the war on terror better or something. Um, Bush was reelected in part because there were many referenda on the ballot against gay marriage in Ohio and many other states at the same time that people were voting for president, and those were very successful. So, I mean, in 2004, I asked you guys to read the Economist article, "The Triumph of the Religious Right." A lot of people looked at that and said, "Well, I guess like America is very conservative. Like, they believe in evangelical Christianity. They believe in a strong, aggressive foreign policy. Like, the 2004 election vindicates and confirms all that." I'm not entirely sure that's true, but that definitely is the way things seemed in 2004. After Bush wins his glorious re-election in 2004, things start to go downhill. Bush tries to privatize Social Security, which is not successful. Um, More on that later. Um, but then there's Katrina in primarily New Orleans, but in other parts of Louisiana and Texas. There's a gigantic hurricane, and this disaster exposes the weaknesses of our levees, our public infrastructure. There are people who can't get. I mean, first of all, the levees break, which is horrible enough. Like, these are supposed to keep you from being engulfed by water. Um, there are people who are poor enough that they can't like even get out of the city knowing that it's going to be inundated. Close to 2,000 people die in this catastrophe. Um, it's probably more than that, but that's the official toll. But Katrina really revealed like the failure and the incompetence and the inadequacy of our infrastructure, our actual like roads, bridges, walls, levees, um, and our political leadership that just seemed to do nothing. We seemed like a third world country um, dealing with this crisis, and a lot of people died, and it was horrible. Like, if you want to know more about it, um, look, watch the Spike Lee documentary about Katrina. Um, it's very good. I would say Katrina was kind of a canary in the coal mine in a way because it showed the deep inadequacies of the system that we have, which is this system, even though we're the richest, most powerful country in the world, we can't like keep our citizens from, um, drowning or starving or being raped. That's a pretty big deal. So going into the 2008 election, Bush was under some, or the Republican Party was under some scrutiny. Um, And what happened in 2008 really gave the lie or challenged like how the Republican Party's dominance was interpreted. There was a big financial crisis that kind of began to evolve in 2006, late 2006, early 2007. Um, the early hints of it were there. Basically, like a lot of people had been given mortgages they couldn't afford. And this is part of like the broader changing the economy and capitalism, which is that like people cannot afford enough to pay for their kids' college or healthcare or housing. Like people literally don't have the money because wage growth has been so low, like or non-existent. Like people don't have more money, but everything is more expensive. So credit comes in as kind of imaginary money. It's like money that might exist. So people take out loans on their houses. They do, double mortgages. They take out crazy, weird mortgages. But like people are still giving out all these things. You can find out about it in the episode that I asked you guys to look out called "The Giant Pool of Money," the This American Life episode. That contains all of it. But the bottom line is that like people were getting like mortgages. Mortgages are debt. So debt can then be like traded and exchanged between other people. I owe you this, but you can sell the debt to somebody else. So what happened with this is that like back in the old days, if you asked for a home loan or a small business loan in your community called Johnsonville, Illinois, or whatever, um, and somebody like the lending officer comes along and says, "Well, is Bill Smith like good for this loan or not? I don't know. Um, I'll give you the money if I think that you and your family and your business will be able to pay back this money for this house or this small business or whatever." Like that was all done on a local scale. What happened in the 80s, 90s, 2000s is that this became totally severed. There would be a lending officer who gives a loan to somebody who says, "Oh, yeah, I make $75,000 a year." Um, okay, fine, great. And somebody would give somebody like a $300,000 loan for a house just based on them saying that I make $75,000 a year. This was happening in the early 2000s. The housing market was going like gangbusters because um, there was lots of credit flying around and lots of people were buying properties. But a lot of people didn't have the money to actually pay for them. And the system actually incentivized it because like lending officers would give the loans to a local person, say like, "Hey, okay, Bill Smith, like, here's your $300,000 for this house. Cool. I think you can pay for it. I don't know." Then they sell the loan to somebody else, they sell that loan to another investor. Like you can own the debt that somebody else owns, so you just sell it to somebody else. And then that person like puts it into a giant like pot of money, like a big vat. Um, and then in that vat there are all these other like little chunks of debt that other people have won. Now it's supposed to work better because in the old system, like if I lent my money to this guy, like if you ever lent any money to anybody, like if they don't pay back, that's my ass. Like it's bad. Like I could lend 30, 50, $100,000 to my friend Bill Smith, um, and I think he's good for it. But if he's not, and he doesn't end up paying me back, then I've lost that money. The whole point of these are called securities. The whole point is that like we take a bunch of those little loans and then we put them all together in a big thing that will have a reduced level of risk because like you could say, well, if one of them fails, I still have 99 others. Like I'm still good. So these things were packaged in things called securities, and those things were then chopped up. People realized, oh, you will, you own this value, these contracts as a big chunk. What if we just chop them up and then we could sell them out as shares to other people? So I have a small share in this big chunk of debt that people have. Eventually, like the whole idea is that eventually the homeowner will pay their mortgage, and then it will filter up to these people. And it's actually supposed to be a hedge against risk. Like it's supposed to be like, well, I own a 1/100th slice of Bill Smith's mortgage. So if it loses, whatever, it doesn't matter. That's the whole idea. What people didn't imagine is that people were giving out lots of loans that were very bad and not based on anything. And then you end up with like a big pot that like there's not just one bad loan or two or three or four or five or seven. There's like a lot of bad loans, and these were being rated as being valuable investments by the credit rating agencies. So people were investing in things that were not worth anything. And in 2006 and 2007, this became extremely clear that a lot of people were going bust on their on their mortgages. And the people who were invested in those mortgages, like the people who were buying these big tranches of like investment that were made up of tiny little parts of other people, like you know Bill and Julia Phillips, like mortgage in Illinois. When those guys go bust, like one of them is fine, but when a lot of them do, then there's a huge problem because we thought we were. When you buy that little slice, you think it's worth something, but if if everybody buys those slices and then a lot of people go bankrupt, then there's a big problem. So that is part of the financial crisis of 2008. It really calls into question like the whole model of American capitalism at that time. Like people don't have wage growth. Um, People are not making more money, but they're still expected to spend more on healthcare, education, housing. So credit is like I said before, like imaginary money in a way. Like instead of, I don't have that money to pay for my mortgage or my kids' college or my kids' you know root canal or this house that we're buying, but I can get credit, and credit is potential money. Everybody had potential money, and it all kind of fell apart in 2008. At that time, you also have a youngish man named Barack Obama, who was a first-term senator from Illinois. He ran for the Democratic nomination, and he got it, and he won the election amid the basic total collapse of the American capitalist economy. Um, at least the financial sector was like Obama was elected at a time where everything was going apart. Now, as far as Obama's concerned, he definitely accomplished some of the things he wanted to do. Um, he didn't accomplish a lot of the things he wanted to do because there was extremely determined opposition to him. Um, but it's too early to decide that. As a historian, I'm not in a place to evaluate like what happened when Obama was president. But one thing I can say is that leading up to Obama and leading up to where we are now, there are a few broad trends that I want to draw out for you guys here. Um, and I think they're very salient for the whole 21st century, but they're also salient now. So, big trends. Number one, the free market. The idea that capitalism will deliver the goods, bring home the bacon. Um, the idea that came out of the 1970s, 1980s, that really we should just deregulate everything and let capitalism do its magic and then like everything will work, um, is under some question in the early 21st century, in the 2000s and 2010s. Um, this is a question about the future of capitalism, and a lot of our politics have been about people, whether on the right or the left, like thinking about what does the free market mean? Like, is it good? Is it bad? I don't know. Second thing, um, I think that the rise of inequality is an inescapable fact that since 1972, the wealth that the top 10% or 2% or 1% has peeled away dramatically from the people who are in the middle, the people who make $60,000 a year, like middle class, working class, poor people. Like they've all stayed kind of the same, but these people have gotten drastically more, and all evidence supports that. Um, a lot of our politics has been about that, and we're trying to figure out how to reckon with it. And I think that underlines a lot of what's happening now. That leads to number three, globalization. I think that in the United States and many other countries, there is an awareness that like the whole idea that like, oh, everybody will trade with everybody, it'll be awesome. Like, you'll go to Nintendo, I'll get an iPad, like everything will be great. Everybody, it's a more interconnected world. There's technology. There's this global market that includes everybody, and everything's more efficient. Everything's better. Um, I think that what we see now shows that a lot of people are not totally sure about that. Actually, in the United States and in Western Europe and in East Asia and other countries, I mean, other parts of the world, um, people are kind of like, I don't know, like, is this actually good for us? Like, my life seems to be getting worse. I think that underlines a lot of the politics of the early 21st century, which can go in a right wing or left wing direction, which I think we've seen both. It's not a political thing, it's just like people are reacting to a frustration and a sense of diminished expectations. The fourth thing that I would mention has to do with diversity and immigration. Um, I've talked a lot in this class about how since 1965, when immigration was liberalized, um, the United States become much more ethnically diverse. Like once we ended that sort of racist policy before 1965 and let like equal amounts of people around from everywhere, um, the United States became much more diverse, and there's just a greater diversity of people here. The country looks different, and I've been saying for years when I teach this class that this diversity is going to be a problem. I don't think it's a problem, but I do think it's a political problem because not everybody is happy about this. The idea that their neighbors are going to like have a different skin color than them. That is a problem that's been coming for a long time. Um, and I recognize that. Also, the country's not only getting more diverse, it's also getting older, relatively speaking. There are more people who are seniors relative to the rest of the population than there's ever been. And, our ability to support and care for them, those of us who are in the wage earning workforce, that is going to be a big challenge for us going forward. It's just a fact. How we decide to deal with it is up to us. Um, I'll close this just by saying that um, I think you guys know that my father was an immigrant to the United States in the 1970s. He came here because the 1965 actually existed. He probably wouldn't have been able to come before that. Um, and obviously, I'm inclined to believe that immigration and diversity are good because otherwise I wouldn't exist as a person. But I do really think that we need to think about like what this means for the society because we've been talking the whole semester about the idea of the social contract, right? Like what are the rules? What are the ground rules? What's the contract? What's the plan? Like if we were roommates in an apartment, like what's our agreement on how things should work? That's fine when we know who us is. But when we bring in new people, it's like, well, you weren't part of the group, like when we made these rules and these decisions. Like, who are you? Like, why are you here? That is the big question that we're going to be facing. Um, who gets to be in our social contract? Who belongs here? How do you work people into the agreements you've already made with your other people who you know in this group? Um, that is a huge crisis. I think that everybody who's watching this knows that it has been a huge problem, not only in the United States, but in other countries. So I would just close by saying, what we decide to do now, um, how we decide to determine who's in that fold, who's in that circle, who's in that group, will say a lot about us and what choices, what decisions we decide to make will have ramifications for the rest of our lives. So the question of who can be in America and who can be part of the group are very real and very powerful right now. Obviously, you can decide to come down whichever way you want on that, but it is a live issue, and it's going to be for probably the rest of our lives. Anyway, it has been such a privilege to work with all of you guys, and I deeply appreciate it. Anyway, have a good night. Bye.